everyone. Welcome back to the Feeding Breeders webinar series. My name's Dawn Haig. I'm part of the PIP team and very happy to be hosting this series with you. Summer's going fast. We're already on our 6th webinar. I'm wondering, I know you're joining us from all over the world. I'm wondering what the weather is like where you are. We're going through a bit of a thunderstorm here in Alberta. So if you hear some bangs behind me, that's what's happening for me. Hopefully the weather's a little nicer for you. We hope that you've been able to attend and enjoy the webinars. And before we start, I'd like to do a quick poll to check in and see how everything is working for you. And while you're filling that out and we're waiting for the responses, I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Tanya Moraes. Tanya is PIP's extension technician. There you are. Welcome, Tanya.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Dawn.
You're welcome. As always, I would like to show our appreciation for our sponsors. Your funding makes this event possible, and we really appreciate your support. Presenting sponsors are the Poultry Innovation Partnership and ARDAR. Platinum level sponsors, Aviagen and EW Nutrition. Gold level sponsors, Merck Animal Health. Silver level sponsors, Cargill, Cobb, and Boehringer Ingelheim. Bronze level sponsors, New Life Mills, Country Junction Feeds, and Canadian Hatching Egg Producers. Supporter level and meal sponsors, Chore Time, Canadian Biosystems Incorporated, Alberta Hatching Egg Producers, Richie Smith Feeds, and Alberta Chicken Producers. Today's webinar asks the question, how do we feed breeders for optimum productivity and welfare? Our speakers today are Dr. Rick Deeth, a behavioral researcher from Scotland's Rural College, and Dr. Stephanie Torrey, research scientist for Trial Nutrition. If you have a moment after the webinar or at any point, I really hope you'll click on the speaker tab in your Feedloop menu. That'll allow you to read more about our speakers' background and career and accomplishments. We don't have enough time right now to go into that, but I really want you to read about them. They're wonderful. So today, our first presenter is Dr. Deeth. Welcome.
There, I've just been unmuted, hadn't I? There we are. So within this topic, our specific title, my specific title today is Developing Measures of Hunger and Satiety for Broiler Breeders. So what is animal welfare? So consumers and citizens in the UK and the European Union have successfully lobbied their politicians to mean that animal sentience is now recognised in law for vertebrate animals and a few invertebrates. And the animal sentience means that animals are considered to be aware and able to experience feelings. And for this means, therefore, that animals are assumed to have mental states which are analogous to our own moods and feelings, which matter to them. And animal welfare is really about these states. As animal welfare scientists, we cannot directly observe or measure these mental states or even prove that they exist, but instead we can use various indirect techniques to infer what these states are. These include behavioural observations, behavioural tests, and various physiological and neurophysiological measures. We can also use measures of the physical state of the animal's body, such as feather cover, energy stores, injury, and ill health. There are various conceptions of animal welfare, all of which try to include the fact that it covers various domains of animal experience. This is the 5 domains model from Mellor, but there are similar approaches, including the 5 freedoms in the UK and Welfare Quality EU project. So this one shows that the nutrition, environment, health and behaviour are all important to the animal, but it highlights that these all impact welfare through their impact on the mental domain, and that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about welfare. So the overall aim of our research on broiler breeders has been to develop behavioural and physiological measures of hunger and satiety that can be used to compare hunger in different situations. such as different diets, different ration amounts, different growth curves, or different breeds. Our studies have used Ross 308 females fed once a day. We've focused on the period during rearing, so 6 to 20 weeks. And if the birds are to be sacrificed for tissue collection, this is usually done at 12 weeks, when we think that restriction is at its most severe. We have some acronyms that I'm using throughout. AL for ad libitum, R for the commercial ration or restricted feeding, and then 2R for twice that amount, 3R, and so on. So we and other researchers use home pen behaviour and behavioural tests. We see in home pen behaviour, we see that feed restriction results in rapid feeding and feed competition, then followed by post-feeding activity, especially foraging, which can either be normal foraging, including pecking and scratching on litter to search for food, or redirected foraging, which can include over drinking or stereotypic pecking at objects or feather pecking. Behavioural tests are used commonly in this literature. Typically, we offer more food and then look at the rate of eating or the total amount of food eaten. I think Steph's going to talk about that a bit more later on. There's also people have used food motivation tests over a number of years where animals are trained to overcome a cost to access extra food. And I think this study of Savory et al. From nearly 30 years ago is particularly striking, where they compared restricted birds with birds which were fed ad lib and then given a period of acute feed restriction where they were deprived of food for up to 72 hours. And they found that the chronic restriction, the R birds, was still even more food motivated than ad lib birds that had been given no food for 72 hours. And I think they're actually more than 3 times more motivated. So I think that's quite striking and really brings home the how much of a welfare impact chronic restriction has on these birds. There have, however, been some criticism of food-based tests, and there are some practical challenges around which feed to offer. Should we give the birds their usual feed? Even if they're on different diets, should we standardize the feed to one of the set, perhaps the commercial ration, or should we use a novel food for all of them? Also, offering extra feed can disrupt the target growth curve, so we can't do that too often within any given study. And finally, does the possibility of food, access to extra food in itself increase motivation? And might out of sight be out of mind for these birds? So if we didn't give them the test, they wouldn't have seemed as hungry. So to get around some of these objections with food being provided during the test, we've developed a test not of feeding motivation, but of foraging motivation. So the birds are given access to an area where they can scratch and peck and forage in some fresh litter. And that's an area that they've not been able to access before. But there's no food reward there provided. And the cost that we make them pay is a naturalistic cost of just walking through water. And over repeated trials, we can increase the distance between the start platform and the foraging platform. We can also make the water deeper, and that's a way of increasing the cost and seeing whether they're still willing to pay that cost. That's a way of testing their motivation to access the foraging area. So with the water runway then, so how many birds are willing to cross the water? So in this validation study, we compared restricted birds, the commercial ration birds shown here in blue, with 2R and 3R birds fed twice or 3 times that amount shown in red and green. And the graph shows the proportion of birds that were willing to walk through water and reach the foraging area. as the depth of water increased on the x-axis here between just covering the bird's feet through to sort of chest depth water, and also the runway was getting longer and longer from 0.5 meter to 4 meters. And you'll see that at every level of cost, it's the restricted birds, the blue line that's above all the others, so a greater proportion of those birds are accessing, and there's less decline between the test 4 and 8 in the R birds, so they're more persistent. We've also tried to develop brain measures of hunger and satiety. So it's just a sort of brief explanation of the physiology of appetite control here. So one of the areas of the brain that's best understood when it comes to appetite control is in the basal hypothalamus, an area called the arcuate nucleus. And here there are, this is a slightly simplified version of this, but there's two key neuropeptides that we look at: agouti-related protein, or AGRP, and pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC. And this situation shows the situation where there's plenty of food, so the bird is satiated, and what happens is that the POMC is released, and it competes with AGRP at the melanocortin receptor. And so in the satiated state, there's low levels of AGRP, and feed intake and feed motivation stays low. When instead you've got a hungry animal or low levels of food intake, the AGRP is expressed more strongly, and this competes at the melanocortin receptor, resulting in increased feed intake or increased food motivation if there isn't extra food. So in order to try and understand more about AGRP and how it responds to feeding levels in these birds, and try and understand whether it might be a short or long-term hunger indicator, we varied feeding rate in this growth curves experiment. So this shows, so the birds were growing between 6 and 12 weeks of age, and then killed to look at their brains. You can see that the lowest line in this graph is the commercial restricted ration. Then the pink line in the middle is twice that amount, and then ad libitum birds at the top line. We also had 2 other treatments, which were birds which started off on the commercial ration and then were either released from restriction for the last 2 days or for the last 2 weeks. The birds that were released for 2 weeks ended up the same weight as the 2 R birds, and this difference between the birds given 2 days of ad lib right at the end and the other restricted birds could just be explained. This difference in weight could just be explained by the crop content, because they had to stuff themselves with lots of food. So in terms of the AGRP levels, this graph just shows the ad lib versus the R and 2R birds, and you can see that restricted birds have got way higher AGRP than ad libs, with the 2R birds intermediate but closer to ad libs. So AGRP increases with chronic restriction. But also this graph now adds in the what happens when we look at the birds that were released from restriction. So they've got to the same body weight, but via a different route. And it looks as though you can see that the AGRP levels are lower for these birds that have had a recent history of being on ad libitum food. So there's some integration of their chronic experience with their more recent experience of access to feed. So it's not just about their current body weight or their current difference between their their actual and desired body weight, I guess. Finally, just to compare these 3 treatments, which all ended up on ad lib. So some of the birds were on ad lib the whole time, and some given ad lib just for 2 days or for 2 weeks. And again, you can see there's AGRP differences. So it's not just what's your kind of current feeding situation. It's also something about the long term. So across this experiment, and by comparing the different treatments, we think that AGRP is an integrated measure reflecting both the short and the long-term feeding state of energy balance and perhaps hunger. And it's not just about the body weight or the current recent restriction history or just the long-term restriction history. It seems to be an integration. So quite an interesting measure to take forward. One subtle difference, though, between the treatments in that last growth curve study was that the time since last meal was less in the birds which finished on ad lib. And to test whether this could have been important in affecting the results, in a new study, we fed birds either ad libitum or restricted in the morning, RAM, or restricted in the afternoon, RPM. And then we sacrificed them to collect brain tissue at different times of day and night. So it was quite hard work for the team involved in this. So all credit to everyone. We'll thank them all at the end. But what we found was that AGRP messenger RNA in the arcuate nucleus was reduced by only around 10% during the first 1 to 3 hours post-feeding, but was then constant over the whole of the rest of the 24-hour period that we studied. So it was only quite a small effect. So it probably couldn't explain our earlier findings, and it's not something we need to worry about too much in future. So finally, I'm just going to talk about some unpublished data where we applied some of these different measures to a high fibre diet study. So we had the restricted and ad libitum birds just fed the commercial diet, and then for some of the birds we mixed in oat hulls, so that represented 20% by weight of their feed, or 40% by weight of their feed. And these were both isoenergetic with the restricted bird. So they weren't growing any faster, as you can see from this growth curve. And we measured home pen behavior, foraging motivation, and brain AGRP. So first up, this graph shows the feeding behavior in the home pen. And you can see the restricted birds in purple, the 20% oat hulls birds in green, the 40% oat hull birds in red, and then the blue ad lib birds, who seem to choose to feed fairly evenly over the whole day, but a bit more in the afternoon. So what you're really seeing is that oat hulls increase the amount of time spent feeding and prolong the feeding a little bit more into the mid-morning. So perhaps not surprising, because you've got increased feed volume. It's just taking these birds a little bit longer to get it down. In terms of the impact on other behaviours, so this graph sort of uses the same colour scheme. You can see what happens is there's a post-feeding peak in litter-directed behaviour. So that's it in the restricted birds. So when the food runs out, they instead go and peck and scratch in the litter and show sort of foraging behaviour. So that peak is then delayed, so it's a bit later in the oat hull 20% birds, and it's even later still in the oat hull 40 birds. So this is kind of the knock-on effect of it taking them a bit longer to eat their food, and possibly a short-term satiety effect of gut fill with all this fibre that's in there. But interestingly, the ad libs show really quite low levels of this litter-directed behaviour. So it shows you that all of the restricted groups are showing considerably more. In the water runway, well, this graph shows a number of birds that were willing to cross the water, and this is very few, because this is out of a total possible of 96. So most of the birds didn't do anything. They didn't attempt to cross the water, and we're not really sure why that was. but of the birds that did, the pattern is what we would expect if oat hulls were having at least some impact on reducing foraging motivation. So what do these birds do instead? Instead of crossing the water, well, they spend time just on the start platform in the foraging test apparatus. And whilst they were there, they forage and peck and scratch at the wooden floor. And this was affected by diet again. So you can see the restricted birds do this the most, ad libs the least, and the oat hulls in the middle there. And finally, the AGRP results. So I guess it's quite disappointing. From a sort of welfare perspective, that it looks as though the oat hulls are making really no impact on AGRP. And the contrast between the restricted diets and ad lib was less than in some of our other studies, but it was still there, still significant. So to summarize the fibre results, in home pen data suggests that oat hulls increase feeding duration, impacting on timing, but not the amount of redirected pecking. The foraging motivation tests with the water runway might suggest some short-term satiety effect of oat hulls, or could just be the same delay we see in the home pen. AGRP was not really affected by isoenergetic fibre or bulk. So it seems to be that it's mostly affected about energy balance and not the gut fill part of satiety. And in fact, if you compare the growth curve for this study with the growth curve experiment, it's perhaps not surprising that those three groups with identical growth curves are not different. So in future and currently, what else we've been doing in this area? Well, my colleague, Dr. Laura Dixon, has been testing slow-growing broiler breeds for accreditation under the UK Red Tractor Enhanced and RSPCA Assured as part of the Better Chicken Commitment. And it seems as though, from her work anyway, there's much improved welfare of the broilers, and the degree of restriction is considerably reduced through crossing with dwarf breeds, as you guys will probably know. I think it would be really interesting to apply some of the measures that we've been developing to modern fast and slow growing breeds to see if we can understand better what's going on for these animals. We've got some other ideas for novel measures. In terms of behaviour, it's been observed that hungry birds show reduced fearfulness, for example, of people, of predators, of novel situations. This could be further explored as a test of hunger. And also there's more to do in the physiology. I think the circuit we've been looking at with AGRP and the arcuate nucleus is really about energy balance, but there must be integration with gut fill as well somewhere else in the brain. So hormone signals coming from the gut and via the vagus nerve. So yeah, more to do and more to understand on that in that area. And I should really give credit to Ian Dunn and Tim Boswell, which I'll do on my next slide. Those guys are really the kind of brains behind that work. And I should also thank many SAC colleagues and students, and yeah, all of our collaborators, students and funders. As shown on this slide, thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Dr. Stephanie Torrey. I think she's going to give her talk now, and then we'll take questions at the end from everyone. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Rick. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. If you can't see my screen, please let me know. Otherwise, I will assume that everything is good to go.
Looks great, Stephanie.
Great, thanks. So just following up on Rick's presentation, I would like to discuss if we can feed conventional broiler breeders to achieve good welfare. Now, as Rick said, there's a number of major welfare concerns with rearing of commercial broiler breeders, which leads to basically what is referred to as the broiler breeder paradox. So if we were to allow broiler breeders to feed to their satiety levels, to feed ad libitum, then they would quickly grow obese, have high mortality levels, and resulting welfare concerns. So as a result, they are chronically feed restricted. And this chronic feed restriction leads to stereotypic pecking, pacing, overdrinking, feather pecking, and aggression. And there's a couple other welfare issues, not necessarily related to feeding, but foot pad lesions, keel bone damage, although I won't go into those at all today. So broiler breeders are feed restricted from about 1 or 2 weeks of age, and that continues throughout their life. Certainly the peak of restriction happens during the rearing period, so around that 12 to 15 weeks of age, but they are still restricted somewhat. That the recording, okay, the recording is continued, sorry. And so, as I said, due to that chronic hunger, they develop a number of behavior problems, such as feather pecking. You can see here in the top video, that hen is repeatedly pecking at the tail feathers of the other bird. And there also can be stereotypic preening, as you can see here, this rooster repeatedly pecking at its own feathers. And so, as Rick mentioned, Savory's early research showed that broiler breeders have a high motivation to feed, even immediately after they have consumed their daily ration. And so Rick went into a bit of the methodologies for assessing hunger. And over the years, people have used a number of different ways to objectively compare the welfare of broiler breeders under different levels of restriction. So to understand the implications of the various practices. And first and foremost, we look at home pen behavior. This is the behavior that the birds perform in their home pen, undisturbed by any manipulations. And so we can study the breeder's behavior before and after feeding, on or off feed days, or compare the birds on different levels of feed restriction. So typically we would quantify the amount of time they spend feeding, drinking, foraging, pacing, pecking, and the like. Now, in a compensatory feed intake or feed motivation test, which Rick had mentioned, we measure the speed at which breeders eat. And so this is based on that early work by John Savory, but also some work by Ingrid de Jong and others. And so we presume, as it's been shown, that the hungrier the breeders are, the faster they will finish their feed. And so this test can be done either with giving breeders a set amount of feed and measuring how long it takes them to consume that feed, or measuring the time to disappearance over a certain amount of period. And we can also do preference tests. And this is particularly for different types of diets. So diets, if they have extra fiber added to them, we can train the birds to associate different feeders or places with the feed through various visual cues. So for example, the blue and red feeders here. We can also test birds' motivation to gain access to a preferred diet, as Rick mentioned, through his water bath test. So commercially, there's been a number of different strategies that have been used to improve welfare on farm. And some of the previous speakers in the webinar series have discussed these. Of course, feed formulation can influence feelings of satiety, especially if the diet density is altered. Although Rick did mention that there were limited capabilities of fiber to influence the welfare of breeders. And a number of researchers, including my group, have explored whether an appetite suppressant can be used to improve welfare. It does work in reducing the appetitive behavior of broiler breeders, but it works either through reducing palatability or causing malaise. So it's really swapping one welfare concern for another. Scatter or broadcast feeding can be used where some or all of the daily ration is scattered in the litter for inducing feeding and foraging behavior. Split feeding practices can be used. And this is when you provide more than one meal a day, typically, but change the quality of the diet between the sessions. So perhaps a standard high density diet might be provided as the morning ration, but a lower density diet with higher calcium levels would be provided in the afternoon. And my colleagues at Trout Nutrition have developed a proprietary split feeding program for breeders based off of some of their earlier research with laying hens. And Rick Van Emes, who presented a couple webinars ago, published a paper last year on split feeding and twice a day feeding and the effects on behavior of breeders in laying. In terms of feeder space and design, these can absolutely affect breeder welfare. And Jeff Nottenbomer, who is a producer in Southern Alberta, he spoke a couple webinars ago on his practices in terms of feeder space, daily feeding, and breeder welfare, with a special focus on management. And the strategy that I'll discuss further, based on my research experience, is feeding frequency. So I want to talk about alternative feeding schedules, either non-daily feeding programs or multiple feedings per day. In North America, non-daily feeding programs are quite common, although, as I said, experimentally, researchers have also looked at increasing the feeding frequency. The two major breeding companies include loose recommendations on using non-daily feeding programs if the producer deems it necessary. And the practice is permitted via the Canadian Codes of Practice. However, there are some countries in the EU that ban the practice of non-daily feeding because of the perceived threat to the bird's welfare. That said, there are many wild animals that don't eat on a daily basis, and I'm sure all of you know someone that has used an intermittent fasting program as a weight management strategy. So we wanted to better understand the effects of skip-a-day feeding on breeder welfare. And we conducted a number of different experiments, comparing different feeding schedules, such as 4-3 and 5-2 feeding schedules, or graduated feeding schedules, which combine various combinations of non-daily and daily feeding schedules. In one study, we compared the home pen behavior, and in this case, the drinking behavior of birds on different feeding schedules on their on and off feed days. And broiler breeders will often redirect their behavior, their motivation towards drinkers, potentially leading to over drinking, but also water spillage, poor litter conditions, and the like. And so on the x-axis, we have the age in weeks, and on the y-axis, the proportion of scans spent drinking, basically the proportion of time. And so we have the non-daily fed birds in blue and yellow on and off feed days, and the daily fed control birds in green. And so what we found was that the birds on non-daily feeding schedules in the dashed blue and yellow, on their off feed days here, adjusted their drinking behavior to their feed days. So they weren't spending more time on those off feed days at the drinker. We also looked at feather condition in a number of different studies. And while broiler breeder flocks don't feather peck as much as some layer flocks do, it's still a welfare concern. Feather loss can reduce the bird's thermoregulatory capabilities, and it also makes the hens more susceptible to injuries during mating. In one study, we compared the feather condition of pullets reared on daily or skip-a-day schedules, and we found that those that were reared on a daily schedule had worse feather condition. A higher feather score denotes worse feather condition than those that were fed on a skip-a-day schedule. And then in another study, comparing daily feeding, the control, to a 4-3 or a graduated schedule, we again found that the daily fed birds had worse feather condition than those that were fed on non-daily schedules. In subsequent studies, we also quantified feather eating because we wondered whether the feather pecking that was happening was due to any consumption of feathers. And so we found that birds, regardless of their feeding schedule, whether they were daily or non-daily, they consumed more feathers on feed days rather than off feed days. And this may be due to a couple reasons. Perhaps the feeding frustration, if birds are, after they consume their daily ration, are not fed to satiety. Alternatively, the feathers may aid in gizzard activity and emptying. So while the behavior of feather pecking and feather eating may serve some purpose for the bird that's performing it, of course, it's not really beneficial for the one that's having their feathers removed. We used a feed intake test to compare the feeding motivation among different feeding schedules. I mentioned this test earlier. On this particular trial, we allowed birds to consume feed ad libitum for a 48-hour period at 6 and 8 weeks of age. And so at 6 weeks of age, we have the daily 5-2 and 4-3 schedule birds. We see that there's quite a bit of variation in the amount of feed that the birds are consuming on a daily basis for this test. However, they all consumed about 120 to 150 grams per bird per day, which is about 3 times as high as what their restricted allotment was for their given body weight and age. And at 12 weeks of age, we saw the same trend, this time statistically different, with the 4-3 consuming more than the 5-2, who consume more than the daily fed birds. And again, they were consuming 150 to 200 grams of feed per day, as opposed to the 48 grams per day that they would receive as per their breed standards. So this led us to one of 2 hypotheses. One hypothesis, a couple of hypotheses, we have 3 of them here. One hypothesis is that the non-daily fed birds were less efficient at mobilizing energy. And certainly this has been shown by research by Steve Leeson. So if they're less efficient, then presumably they're hungrier than the others. A second explanation is that the birds that were fed on non-daily basis may simply have had larger crops from consuming larger daily feed allotments, which then enabled them to physically consume more feed during that 48-hour period. And a third hypothesis is that having larger quantities of feed on on-feed days perhaps trains birds to consume feed faster and allows them to better compete for what they would perceive as limited rations. Of course, not limited rations in this test. And so to better understand how different feeding schedules influence gastrointestinal tract and perhaps any physiological reasons for differences in behavior, we reared birds to 6 and 12 weeks of age on one of 5 diets. Now this is just data from the birds at 12 weeks of age, and they were fed on one of 5 diets, but you can ignore the 3 in the middle, alternative SPH and CAP, because those were diets bulked up with soybean hulls and calcium propionate. So what I want you to focus on here is control in the green line and the 4-3 schedule in the blue line. So we fed the birds in the morning, and then we slaughtered them at 1.5, 6, and 24 hours after they finished their feed and measured their gastrointestinal contents. And so these are the wet contents, but the dry contents followed a similar pattern. And so at both 1.5 and 6 hours after eating, the birds that were fed on a 4-3 schedule, who had received about 43% more feed that day than those fed on a daily basis, had more than twice the amount of crop contents as those that were fed on a daily basis. So that was at both 1.5 and 6 hours after feeding. However, at 24 hours after the last feed, all treatments had similar amounts of crop content, very little, and similar amounts through the different regions of the gut. So there is evidence of a larger crop, due to larger daily feed allotment, but we didn't find any indication that the non-daily fed birds were able to maintain stores 24 hours after feeding. So over numerous studies, we found that non-daily feeding did marginally improve some welfare indicators, but not others. And the performance results were generally a wash. In addition, rearing schedules can have long-lasting effects on breeder feeding motivation. I didn't show, but we looked at feeding motivation at the end of production, even after birds had been fed on daily schedules for all of lay, and there were still differences among the feeding schedules. And others have reported that the predictability of non-feeding schedules plays a large role in welfare implications of those schedules. So a graduated feeding schedule that alters the number of on-feed days numerous times during that rearing period may make it difficult for breeders to adapt both behaviorally and metabolically to those changes. And so as an alternative to non-daily feeding, researchers have studied whether increasing the feeding frequency would improve welfare. And there have been a few recent studies into increasing breeders' feeding frequency. And Martin Zwiedhoff at the University of Alberta has developed a precision feeding system for breeders that enables multiple small meals per day for each of the birds. But with the smaller meals, will breeders ever be able to reach satiety? And in a really neat study that was published last year, Nicole Zakuski, I'm probably butchering that name, she found that breeders that were fed ad libitum from these precision feeders made fewer visits as they grew. So therefore had larger meals, but fewer visits to those feeders. But she found no evidence of satiety in the breeders that were fed even up to 22% more feed allotment. And other groups have looked at twice a day feeding, either alone or in conjunction with other feeding strategies such as added fiber or scatter feeding. And increasing the frequency had only really minor effects on the bird's behavior, and there was no difference in their feeding motivation. So it doesn't look like increasing the feeding frequency will be a cure-all for the welfare concerns. And so coming back to this slide, while I only discussed the feeding frequency, the other strategies also appear to be not much better or worse than the status quo for conventional breeders. So in order to effectively reduce the welfare concerns surrounding feed restriction, we need to look at how we can lessen feed restriction. And so I'm sure you're all familiar with the Better Chicken Commitment, which is a pledge driven by a number of animal advocacy groups that over 200 companies signed on to make changes to broiler production, including the use of slower growing broiler breeds by 2026. And so, of course, the breeder industry then will need to supply the broiler industry with what they're looking for in terms of breeds. Now, some 20 years ago, there was research comparing the welfare of conventional and slower growing breeders, particularly with a focus around dwarf breeds and Label Rouge strains. And Heck and colleagues found that there were significant differences in mortality rates. Of course, we know that breeders that are fed ad libitum have high levels of mortality, but they were able to feed the dwarf and Label Rouge breeds ad libitum without the resulting increase in mortality. And using those same strains, Jones and colleagues found that the dwarf and Label Rouge hens had fewer behavioral indicators of hunger than the conventional birds. However, there hasn't been a lot of research that has been done in the resulting years, simply because there wasn't a lot of interest in adopting slower growing broilers. Now that has changed. And so as part of the broiler project that I led at the University of Guelph, we had the opportunity to work with slower growing breeders. And we studied 3 female and 2 male lines. And here you can see their growth rates during rearing and lay. So we had 2 lighter and 1 intermediate body weight female lines, and then our 2 male lines. And so there was some level of feed restriction during rearing to control early development of the birds. However, during lay, the average feed cleanup time was about 8 to 10 hours, with some pens having feed left over the next day. And so, of course, a critical piece of breeder production, not just growth and welfare, but is their egg output. And so what we found was that for 2 of the breeds in particular, their weekly laying rate was on par or better than what we would expect from a conventional strain, laying over 165 eggs per hen with high fertility and high hatch of fertile eggs. And so for those of you that have had the opportunity to work with slower growing breeders, it's really night and day from fast growing breeders. So you walk in, they're quiet, they're calm, there's not really any feather pecking. And for the strains that we studied, we didn't beak treat any of them, but there was no feather pecking. And when we looked at their feeding motivation at the end of production, using the same tests that we had used in previous studies with conventional strains, we see the slow A, B, and C at 52 weeks of age versus the conventional that were fed daily or skip a day at 65 weeks of age. You can see that there were considerably lower levels of compensatory feed intake in those birds at the end of production. And so through our studies, we've learned that you can make small improvements by bulking up the diet or changing feeding schedules. Yet conventional broiler breeders are still chronically hungry. And so there's really hasn't been any feeding strategies that have significantly moved the goalposts for breeder welfare. However, our research does not support that a ban on skip-a-day feeding is warranted, because it's no better or worse than daily feed restriction. Now, while broiler breeders are efficient and productive, there's really no way around the current levels of feed restriction for them. And so with the broiler industry incorporating some slower growing genetics, there is a huge need for research into the welfare of slower growing breeders. And I hope that there will be an increase in this type of research in the future. Now, I do want to acknowledge my former students who did all the hard work that I presented, Drs. Krista Morrissey, Brittany Lastraco, Aitor Arizola, and Elise Moscow. And finish up here, and I'm happy to answer any questions with Rick that you may have.
Thank you very much for the great presentation from both of our speakers. It was very interesting today. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A box. We started a little bit late for a technical problem. I apologize, but we still stay around for 10 more minutes, 15 minutes for questions. I have a question here. As Lynn talks, Dr. Tori, in a split feeding system, would it be beneficial for the hen to provide more protein, energy, or other nutrients in the morning than in the afternoon, just like you do with the calcium?
That's a great question. I don't have a lot of experience with split feeding programs, but I do think that the focus is on providing more protein and energy, and really trying to get the highest quality feed into the breeders in the morning, and providing just something to help fill their gut in the afternoon. So I do believe that that is generally the approach that is taken.
Dr. Deef, I found your presentation very interesting, especially the part where you have the birds crossing the water, but you really haven't answered the title of the session, that how do we feed breeders to optimal productivity and welfare? Could you try to answer that question?
Yeah, I think, well, I think probably my talk and Steph's talk has shown that most of the things that people have tried have not been able to square that particular circle, and that breeders are really, at the moment, are just fed for, I mean, I guess understandably, for optimum productivity. I mean, you know, nutritionists that we've heard from mostly so far in this series have talked about, you know, optimum sort of egg quality and reproductive rate and so on, and that's so really the focus is on reproductive success, and that's the target, that's the thing they try to optimize. And so there's really no compromising with welfare. I mean, I guess our work shows that you can't restrict energy with fibre and achieve much improvement, but probably if we could find a way to feed the birds a bit more in terms of the actual quantity, the energy, whilst still achieving good reproductive outcomes, that would be a step in the right direction. And obviously the stuff that Steph was talking about there with these slower growing breeds, it seems like it's easier to achieve a better balance between welfare and productivity in those breeds. But yeah, you're right, I didn't really answer the question. I tried to answer the different one.
There have been studies looking at adiponectin as it is related to feeding behavior. Have your studies looked at both the brain neurotransmitters and the metabolic hormones at the same time? I'm just wondering if ad libitum feeding is the best trial control, knowing that this approach is not a healthy approach for breeders.
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of two questions in there. So if we looked at hormones and what would be what's the right controls? I mean, we've always used commercial restriction and ad libitum as a sort of two extremes that just include in every trial to try and understand what's going on between those two extremes. So yeah, I guess ad libitum we tend to just begin at 6 weeks and end at 12. I mean, we can't let the birds keep going ad libitum for too long because it's very much not healthy. But yeah, in terms of gut hormones, and adipose tissue hormones, we have collected gut samples in a lot of these studies and tried to look at gene expression in gut tissue for various relevant genes around the hormonal signaling from the gut, but largely it's been rather fruitless and frustrating process. It's not been as productive or successful as we'd hoped. Yeah, it's really Ian Dunn he's the physiology expert. He's my sort of colleague that would probably have a much better answer to that question. But yeah, I mean, I think having sort of talked about AGRP, that's the neuropeptide that really gave us those very striking results and in the growth curve study, and it just was, I've hardly ever seen data like that in my scientific career where every single treatment is significantly different from every other single treatment. It was quite a striking data, so we really honed in on that. But I guess it's clearly not giving us the full picture to understand the way that the brain integrates the gut signals, adipose tissue signals, and sort of the sort of long-term target that the animal's trying to achieve, and how that is integrated in the brain. I guess nobody really knows at this point.
Another question for Dr. Torrey. Has there been any work on breeding behavior or male management issues in slow-growing breeds?
That's a great question. There hasn't been a lot of research, published research into slower growing broiler breeders. And I think that the male management will continue to be a problem because it's typically the female lines that have the slower growing genetics versus the male line. So there still is quite a bit of feed restriction going on for those roosters. I also think one of the other things that we need to address is the potential for injuries to the females. They're slower growing breeds. The females will be quite a bit smaller than the males. We quantified keel bone deviations and fractures at the end of production and found quite a bit in our hens. And so whether the weight disparity between the hens and roosters is then creating a different welfare problem with bone fractures and bone deformations. But I think that perhaps there's an increase in adoption of slower growing broilers, there'll be more opportunities for people to look at those slower growing breeders, since there will be a need to have them in production.
Dr. Diff, I have another question here. I think this one's for you. There's much work looking at microbiome and its role in signaling. Is there any work in this area with breeders?
In relation to satiety, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In welfare. and the signaling in the brain that they are like satisfied?
Not to my knowledge, but that's not to say that it doesn't exist. I'm not necessarily fully on top of the literature. Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's certainly there's a lot of interest in microbiome now, isn't there? So it could be a fruitful area to look at. I'm going to make a note. Thanks for the question.
So here I have a question that could be for both. There are different strategies to try to improve the welfare of broiler breeders. If you could pick one alternative that you think that works, that has been working best, would be like slow growing breeds, high fiber in the diets. If you could pick one that you think we have to research this one more, because I think this is one of the one that's gonna work, which one would you think is the way?
I mean, for me, I think really the only way to significantly improve breeder welfare is by changing the breeds. But that said, it's not like the breeding industry can just decide to make these changes wholesale. It's dependent on the broiler industry, and it's dependent on consumers and their wants for the resulting products. So in an ideal world, yes, I would love to see more research into slower growing breeders, because I think the rest of the strategies are just a band-aid solution.
Yeah, I would second that. With the slower growing breeds seem to be producing the best outcome at the moment. I mean, unless we went completely back to the drawing board on the breeding goals. I mean, Marion Dawkins made the radical suggestion quite a few years ago now that we could look at bending the growth curve. She talked about birds, she talks about birds like pigeons where they grow incredibly rapidly to adult size and then just stop. So you don't sort of, and that's just like a normal wild bird, right? So it does seem like it's possible to have rapid growth in juveniles, which doesn't have these knock-on effects. But I think early growth and later growth are highly genetically correlated. So it would have to be something that was worked on. Yeah, it may not be possible. It might just be a pie in the sky idea. But yeah, I guess we can't crossbreed with pigeons. Yeah, I don't know. I'm throwing out possibly an impossible challenge to the breeding industry. They might be happier with the slow-growing breeds than that.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question. Is there a possibility of changing the current selection criteria of broilers and breeders that would still utilize the current populations?
I mean, the breeding companies already use a multifactorial approach, and certainly they've incorporated welfare traits into selection for broilers and for breeders, incorporating leg traits and cardiovascular fitness. So I think hunger and feeding rate is a bit difficult though, because of course, if you're selecting for growth rates, you're selecting for birds that will want to consume more feed. And so having those traits in the broilers will mean that we need them in the broiler breeders. But I do wonder whether there's anything that we can do to manipulate the kind of transgenerational effects of feeding strategies on grandparent flocks to then influence the feeding behavior of the broiler breeders without having a negative impact on the performance of broilers.
I mean, so at the moment, the breeding goals are around, the offspring need to grow fast and efficiently, and then we'll just try and achieve good reproductive success with any type of feed management in the broiler breeder. You could imagine a situation in which you try to introduce a rule that said restriction has to stop at 1/3 of ad lib or 40%, 50% of ad lib, and then you have to try and then breed birds that can cope with that level of feed and still reproduce. So you I guess it's a little bit like the Formula One teams. Every year they introduce new rules, and then, well, these are the new rules, guys. Just have to design the best car. So, you could imagine some sort of artificial constraint like that would stop that gap. Because it seems like year on year that the degree of restriction is getting worse and worse as the broilers grow faster and faster. So I don't know. I mean, again, I'm probably, if there was somebody here from the breeding industry, they'd probably be furious, because all my suggestions are perhaps very difficult to achieve and not very commercial. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it is a very challenging topic. That's why we came up with the idea for this series, like to discuss all these questions, because it's not an easy fix. It's not easy, right? So there's still a lot to study and discuss about that. So I have one more question here. Can it be that birds feel less restricted around 12 weeks of age when diets fed are isoenergetic, but containing more energy out of fat than out of carbohydrates? And why?
Is that a question to me? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. That sounds like a nutritionist. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about there's the debate in the human literature, isn't there, about the satiating effects of high protein or high fibre or fat versus carbs. I mean, it's not really my area of expertise. I don't know. I'll stop talking now.
I wouldn't say, 12 weeks is generally about the peak in feed restriction per quantity compared to what they would receive per body weight. But I don't know if they're necessarily different phased feedings through that mid-rearing period that would target satiation, because I think a lot of the feed formulations are targeting preparing birds for entering lay while maintaining their kind of constant state of growth. But I do think that there probably are opportunities, and certainly with Martin Zwiedhoff with his precision feeding program, I think is able to then adapt the diets per the individual bird, depending on their growth curve and their age. So I think that there is potential for looking further into that.
Thank you. So I have here another question for Dr. D. You have mentioned slow-growing breeders in the UK. How successful is that so far? Will consumers end up forcing change in the breeder industry as they have with cage layers in the table egg industry?
Yeah, I don't know to what extent the UK is an outlier. I mean, I think it's pretty common in Europe that people do buy the RSPCA branded products, and it's also coming more into the mainstream now with Red Tractor, which is our kind of farm assurance for all farms. They're also kind of introducing a sort of higher tier welfare accreditation. So it seems to be an expanding niche. I'm not sure what the current global situation with food prices and inflation squeezing consumers, is going to do to that. It might be that people can't buy these sort of the premium products as much. Although there's some data suggesting that people just cut down, so they'll sort of, if they really want to protect chicken welfare, they'll eat less chicken, but go for, as whatever they perceive to be high quality chicken, whether that be organic or breeds or high welfare labeling. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to see how the global breeding industry that tends to have just global breeding goals and objectives, and have birds that's trying to work on every continent, how they adapt to these niches in Europe and in the UK. What was the question again?
Well, how successful are the slow growing breeds in the UK? And if you think that the consumers will force a change in the breeder industry as it happened with cage layers in the table egg industry?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the of all of the welfare labelling schemes, the eggs one has been the one that's had the most impact, and I think that's because the so much of the value, sort of 100% of the value of the product is there in the egg in the sort of labelling scheme, whereas some of the other areas, like in pigs and beef and stuff, it's often only kind of prime cut, so it's only some small percentage of the carcass value which is able to be sold at a premium. So that can influence, if sort of 80% of chicken meat has to go into the kind of all the other chicken meat, and you only get a premium on some part of it, then that might influence the rate of uptake as well as the thing I've already said. But I don't have the figures to hand as to what the percentage is in the UK of uptake of these sort of RSPCA assured breeds, and whether it's growing. I'm afraid I don't have that information to hand.
I know that in some countries, like the Netherlands, there's much larger uptake of slower growing breeds. So the vast majority of the breeder flocks are slower growing. Similarly in France, with the Label Rouge program that's been around for a long time, that where there's the market for slower growing broilers, there of course will be the slower growing breeders. I don't have a crystal ball to see what percentage of the North American market will make a transition to slower growing, but it's not going to be 100%. Consumers want choices based on their values and their financial abilities. So,
thank you very much, Dr. Adif and Dr. Stephanie Tori. Our time is over and I don't see any new questions coming. So thank you very much for your participation today. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you still have questions, please add them to the discussion board. Have a great day and I see you all next Thursday.
okay, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.